tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello, folks. Welcome to the Power of Zero show. I am your host, best-selling author, David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You Lerp, The Volatility Shield, and a Tax-Free Income for Life. If you're looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, head on over to davidmcknight.com. Be happy to hook you up with a member of our elite POZ advisor group, among the very best advisors in the nation at helping shepherd you to the 0% tax bracket. If you are a financial advisor and are looking to adopt these principles into your practice, you can head over to powerzero.com and opt into our free 3-part video series. Be happy to have a call with you. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at McKnight&Co, at McKnight&Co. And if you want to watch our movie, The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming, you can watch that pretty much anywhere you stream movies. Once again, if you would like to buy copies of any of my books and single copies, you can go to Amazon or wherever else you buy fine books, or you can buy them in bulk at davidmcknightbooks.com. In recent podcasts, I've been talking a lot about the financial implications of Joe Biden's, what we're now calling the Human Infrastructure Plan. It's going to cost $3.5 trillion. It's been rumored that with the increase in taxes on the rich that would go along with that $3.5 trillion signature legislation, that this is a no-cost piece of legislation. In other words, it's not going to cost you and me anything. That's actually not the case when you think about the long-term implications of these programs over time. And I may do a podcast on this in the future. There are implications over the long run of, in terms of costs for this program. So I've railed a bit on Joe Biden, and I try not, as you know, I try not to make any comments on the legislation itself, only really the financial implications of the legislation. Well, I really want to step back and remind all of us that fiscal insanity is a bipartisan venture, and it has been for at least the last 20 years. If you were to look at a graph of the debt going up, you would find that it goes up just as much under Republican administrations as it does under Democrat administrations. And case in point, I'm going to be referencing an article from ProPublica where the jury really has come in on the Trump administration in terms of how much debt was accumulated during the arc of his 4-year administration. So the question is, exactly how much did debt go up under Donald Trump? It went up almost $8 trillion in 4 years. That's $2 trillion per year. That's historically, it's gone up, at least in the last 5 years, it's gone up about, it's slated to go up about $1 trillion per year, driven primarily by Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, as baby boomers file out of the workforce and onto the rolls of the entitlement programs. It's really those programs that are driving that debt. But because of some other things that we'll talk about, some other mitigating circumstances that we're going to talk about, the debt actually averaged $2 trillion per year over Trump's administration. In case you're keeping tabs on that, that means that that's an extra $23,500 in new federal debt for every person in the country. So you may be thinking, well, gosh, it's all relative. How does this compare to other presidents throughout history? Well, it puts him in the top 3. Of course, adjusted for inflation and adjusted for the cost of the dollar. There's only 2 other presidents that have come close. One was George W. Bush and the other was Abraham Lincoln, both of whom oversaw sort of extraordinary situations during their administrations. Of course, for Abraham Lincoln, that was the Civil War. And for George W. Bush, it was the 2 foreign conflicts that occurred in the wake of 9/11. So part of the issue is that Donald Trump campaigned on this promise that he would decrease national debt and that he would do so without touching any of the entitlement programs. So first of all, we know that one of the things that drove up the debt was the COVID-19 crisis. And I think that economists agree that we needed massive deficit spending. This is very similar to what happened in 2008. You had to sort of resuscitate. You needed this economic defibrillator, as it were, for the economy. So I don't think anybody is faulting Trump for taking extraordinary measures during the economic cataclysm of COVID-19. The problem was the national debt had already soared to sort of grave levels even prior to COVID-19. In fact, Trump himself called it a crisis and a grave threat. Now, why did the debt grow so much during Trump's administration? Well, as you know, over the course of my podcast, I've talked about the solution to this problem is either raising revenue, cutting spending, or some combination of the two. Well, what happened during the Trump administration is just the opposite. He actually cut revenue with the 2017 tax cut. And if you're like me, I like tax cuts just as much as the next guy. That's part of the reason I'm in Puerto Rico. But what he did was he cut taxes, but he also didn't institute any serious cuts in spending. And so the combination of lowering taxes on individuals and especially on corporations and refusing to really do anything about entitlement programs or any of the other spending initiatives. Truly, the entitlement programs are what's driving most of the debt. Debt really soared to unprecedented levels. And so by the time COVID smacked our country right in the face, there was very little margin for error at that point. And so what this has essentially done is it's pushed our debt to the point where it's as high, actually higher than it was in the immediate wake of World War II. There's a major difference between now and World War II, though. And the difference is with World War II, the thing that drove all that debt up was wartime spending. And when the war was over, we were able to get rid of that wartime spending and dramatically reduce spending through that war demobilization. And so it was a problem that was easily solved. The problem that we're running into right now is we have similar levels of debt relative to GDP, except we've got this massive financial overhang from Medicare and Social Security. They're going to make it much more difficult to dig ourselves out of this debt crisis. And as we know that, Trump campaigned on this idea of really paying down debt. He sort of painted himself as a president who would handle the debt, pay it down, and not make any fiscally irresponsible decisions. In fact, when he was interviewed in 2016 by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa from the Washington Post, he said that he could pay down the debt, which was about $19 trillion at the time, over a period of 8 years by simply renegotiating trade deals and spurring economic growth. By the way, this is a big myth that people believe, which is simply not true. And that's that we can grow our way out of this economic crisis. The economy can do so well over a sustained period of time that it'll bring so much revenue flowing into the Treasury that we can not only pay for entitlement programs, not cut those back at all, but also pay down the national debt. It's simply, if you see a graph in your mind's eye, what the debt is going to do over time is it's sort of like a hockey stick. It's going straight up. Whereas the revenue coming in from even, say, 5% growth in the economy sustained over time, which is impossible, if you ask me, there's just a little, tiny line that's not even close to keeping up with that hockey stick, which is the national debt, as it increases by leaps and bounds over time. So after Trump took office, he predicted that the economic growth created by the 2017 tax cut, combined with the tariffs that he was planning on imposing on a wide range of goods from a lot of different countries, would help eliminate the budget deficit and help the U.S. begin to pay down the debt. In fact, when Sean Hannity interviewed him in 2018, this is July of 2018, he said, quote, "We have $21 trillion in debt. When this tax cut really kicks in, we'll start paying off that debt like it's water." And 9 days later, he tweeted, quote, "Because of tariffs, we will be able to start paying down large amounts of the $21 trillion in debt that has been accumulated much by the Obama administration." Well, as you know, and as we've tracked the debt since then, that's not exactly how it played out. In fact, when he took office in January of 2017, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office was projecting that federal budget deficits would be 2 to 3% of our GDP during Trump's term. But the deficit, get this, the deficit reached nearly 4% of GDP in 2018 and 4.6% in 2019. That's almost double what they were predicting. So what were the main culprits here? What was driving all of this debt? Well, there's a couple of culprits as we've discussed. The first one was the Trump tax cuts. Now, as I said, I'm a big fan of paying as little as you possibly can. A lot of our strategies revolve around you paying as little as you possibly can. But the Trump tax cuts, particularly the sharp reduction in the corporate tax rate, it went from 35 to 21, and I'm all in favor of that. But that took a huge bite out of federal revenue, and we didn't cut any spending along the way. So naturally, all of that increased. In fact, the CBO projected that would increase the debt by almost $2 trillion over 11 years. So that was part of it. The other one was that Trump's Trump claimed that the increased revenue from these tariffs would help pay down the national debt. That didn't happen. And just to give you an idea on this, the tariffs did bring in additional revenue. In fact, in 2019, they netted about $71 billion, but he gave $36 billion of it back to farmers who were affected by the trade wars. If you recall, he got into sort of this trade war with China, and so they stopped buying our stuff. And so Trump basically paid off the farmers by giving them a portion of the revenue that came in from these tariffs. And so about half of that revenue went to farmers. So there wasn't very much left. In fact, the amount that was left was enough to pay about 3 weeks worth of interest on the national debt. You know, once we sort of can appreciate the vast scope and size of the national debt, you start to realize that taxing the rich, even at 100% levels, is only enough to really pay the interest on the debt and fund a couple of these programs for a couple of weeks. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, there's just huge fiscal, unsustainabilities in the entire scope of the federal government's budget. Okay, so by early 2019, the national debt had climbed to $22 trillion. And by this point, Trump was calling it a grave threat to our economic and societal prosperity. So, I mean, at least vis-a-vis the American public, he was telling us that this is a big problem. It's a national debt crisis. We need to do something about it. But by the end of 2019, the debt had risen to $23 trillion. And more members of his cabinet, more federal officials were sort of sounding the alarm. They were saying, for example, Philip Swagel, who is the director of the CBO in January 2020, said, "Not since World War II has the country seen deficits during times of low unemployment that are as large as those that we project, nor in the past century has it experienced large deficits for as long as we project." So here's the thing, historically, we have racked up debt, but typically we've had good excuses for doing so. Fiscal emergencies, wars, those types of things, crises of some sort or another. We racked up this debt during periods of time when the stock market was exploding, there was low unemployment, the economy was going gangbusters. And this is something that Maya McGinnis said in our film. She says, while every other country in the world is getting their fiscal house in order, we just continue to pile debt onto the national credit card. So as it turns out, by 2021, when COVID started to take off, the national debt jumped to $27.75 trillion, which was up 39% from when Trump was sworn in, when it was just under $20 trillion. So the government ended its 2020 fiscal year with a portion of the national debt owed to investors of about 100% of GDP. And that's really the important part, is that the portion of national debt that we owe to investors is at 100% of GDP. Well, guess what? Where are we right now? We are currently at 130%. If you ask David Walker or Larry Kotlikoff, how do you feel about that debt to GDP number of 130%? And the alarm bells will absolutely be going off. Now, we know that the reason why, and as I said this, I think it bears repeating, the reason why now is different than World War II, where we had similar levels of debt to GDP, is because we are funding Social Security, Medicare. We have 10,000 baby boomers marching out of the workforce onto the rolls of the entitlement program. So these outlays are slated to rise sharply. Whereas in the immediate wake of World War II, there's no such thing as Medicare, and Social Security was just starting out. So we just didn't have these types of issues. All right. So in addition to forcing us to reduce the proportion of the budget spent on the future to help pay for the past, there's a second reason that huge and growing budget deficits matter, and that's, of course, interest cost. And I've long warned that it's not so much the debt, it's the interest on the debt, the cost of renting the money that we've already spent. So most of the government's borrowing to fund pandemic relief has been short-term borrowing. A lot of people don't realize that the national debt is short-term borrowing. What that means is that that debt will have to be refinanced. If we don't want to pay it back, it's going to have to be refinanced. And if interest rates go up in the interim, the cost of that interest on all that debt is going to skyrocket, and it's eventually going to consume the entire federal budget. And that's why when we talk about planning for retirement in terms of the types of accounts within which we are growing and accumulating our wealth, do we want to get the deduction today? Well, tax rates are historically low? Do we want to postpone the payment of those taxes till some point further down the road? Or do we want to pay those taxes at today's historically low tax rate so that by the time we get to the point in our country where, the entire federal budget is consumed by the interest on the national debt and they're forced to raise taxes, that we can then take that money out tax-free when everybody else is sort of getting raked over the coals? So this is what CBO Director Swagel had to say on the subject in a report to congressional Republicans in December. He said, although the current low interest rates indicate that the debt is manageable for now and that the United States is not facing an immediate financial crisis, of course, that's because the interest rates stay artificially low, in which interest rates abruptly escalated or other disruptions occurred, the risk and potential budgetary consequences of such a crisis become greater over time. All right, folks. So let me sum up here what I'm really trying to communicate to you in this podcast, at least this episode of this podcast. It has really been an overarching theme throughout all of my podcasts. Look, fiscal malfeasance is a bipartisan issue. It's not something that is unique to Democrats. It's not something that's unique to Republicans. There is blame to spread all over the place. And the Trump administration the track record on this was an absolute train wreck. As long as we're running with train themes here, it was an absolute train wreck, okay? I am not happy with the spending that Joe Biden has proposed with his social infrastructure package, but we can't ignore the damage that was done during the Trump administration. And if you're a Republican, you need to insist that your Republican elected representatives show some leadership regarding this issue. Just like I would say if you're a Democrat, you need to insist that your leaders show some leadership when it comes to the fiscal sustainability of our country. So, everybody loves to sort of sling mud during these partisan wars, but the reality is that all of our elected representatives on both sides of the aisle are responsible for getting us into this mess. So even though I sharply criticize what's going on right now, we need to be clear-eyed about the reality that at least historically, all presidents over the course of, I would say, the last 25 years have acted sort of according to this same template. They're supposed to be cutting spending, probably raising revenue. What have we done historically? We've lowered revenue and we've increased spending all along the way. So Republicans and Democrats don't like to modify the programs that are driving all this debt. It's mainly Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are the things that are really getting us into trouble. And that's what's accounting for all of the, the fiscal deficit year over year over year. So unless we sort of act and strike at the heart of the problem, whether that means pushing out the age by which you receive Social Security and Medicare or what have you, we are going to continue to see sharply escalating debt. And all that really does is increase the likelihood that tax rates, even in the next 10 years, will be dramatically higher than they are today. So that's my conclusion. The Trump administration, from a debt perspective, is a total disaster. We are looking at similar types of debt levels during the Biden administration if we're not careful here. And we look to be spending money that we really don't have in the same way that Trump spent money that we didn't have at that point. So, okay, so that's the podcast for today. If you're looking for help to insulate yourself from the impact of rising taxes, why not work with a member of our POZ Elite Advisor Group, trained, vetted, qualified personally by me, among the best tax-free retirement plan specialists in the nation. If you're an advisor and needs help to transition your practice to a Power of Zero style practice, head on over to powerofzero.com. Happy to set up a call with you. All right, folks, that's it for this week. We look forward to chatting with you same time next week.